If you're a dentist and you want to start a dental practice from scratch, or you want to buy a dental practice, then here are a few items that I think you should consider based on my experience. So one of the things is your level of debt and your level of cash flow need. So this is really important because I often see doctors who have higher level of debt where they need quite a bit of cash flow, and they start a practice and they simply don't have enough cash flow to make their life work, or they buy a practice that's simply too small. So the first step is to get together with your CPA, who's going to help you determine how much cash do you need a month. Do you need $5,000? Do you need 10? Do you need 20? So how much money do you really need to live off of in a way that it's honest? Okay, so that's number one. So you need to know your cash flow need, and that's going to determine what kind of practice you can start or what kind of practice you need to buy. If you have a high cash flow need, you may need to buy a practice that's providing at least that much cash flow. So you may need to buy an established practice. If you're starting a practice from scratch, of course, you're not going to have much cash flow at the beginning, and it's possible for quite some time, depending how you set it up. So that's number one, cash flow need, okay? So number two is the area where you're thinking about setting up a practice or buying a practice. And this is where 99.9% of the doctors go wrong. If you set up a practice in an area where patients don't have much dental need and there are a ton of providers, meaning there's a lot of dentists, you're not going to do very well, most likely, because it's a perfect storm to have a really slow or low producing dental practice, because patients simply don't need a lot of work and there are already too many dentists in the area. So these are like high middle class and middle class, very urban areas. I see this all the time, where doctors simply struggle, and sometimes they even have to close their practices because they simply cannot make it work. I have had a number of doctors who called me that after 5 years, they're still only taking home $60,000 a year, which is barely a hygienist salary. And that's because they set up a practice in an area that's very saturated with dentists, and it's a high middle class area where patients don't need any dentistry. So what kind of area is a good area to set up a practice in? Well, I think I would look for a combination of area where patients have high dental need and there are less providers. It's kind of a no-brainer, although I think a lot of people kind of miss this. So what kind of areas are those? These are predominantly blue-collar areas, and it does not have to be rural. It could be city. So a lot of areas in a city are blue-collar, especially if you go out of the downtown area and you're not in a suburb, but you're in between the downtown and the suburb area. Those tend to be predominantly very blue-collar areas, and those areas are very often have high dental need and they have less providers. Now, obviously, the further you go out of town, the less providers you're going to be, because many of the young doctors want to be in a big city, and that's just the way things are now for quite some time, for about the last 20, 30 years, and most people don't want to live in a rural area. And if you're okay living in a rural area, that's usually a perfect storm to have a really busy practice, because you're going to be in an area where you get patients with high dental need, and you're going to have less providers. And real estate and practices are going to be selling for less of a premium, so life is going to be a lot cheaper, especially if you can go back to the area where you grew up. So for example, if you grew up in a rural area that's predominantly blue collar, you can do really, really well. For example, most of my most profitable practices that I work with doctors are exactly like that. So it could be both urban or it could be rural, but I would look for areas that's predominantly blue collar and predominantly underserved areas, probably low middle class, blue collar, with less providers in the area, and you can do really, really well in those areas. The other thing to consider is really quality of life. Like, can you see yourself in an area just because something comes up for sale, or if it seems like a good area in a very rural town, but you're never lived in a small town and you're kind of a big city person? Are you going to be happy living in an area, and is your partner or spouse going to be happy living in an area, and are you going to be happy raising a family there or just living there? So that's another important factor, because you don't want to set up a practice in a perfect area just to realize that you're completely miserable being there. And it's not for everybody. Like, I'm not more of a city guy, I'm more of a country guy. So I wouldn't be super jazzed living in a big city or working in a big city. I never really liked it. I love rural areas, but the vice versa is true too. Some doctors just don't mesh really well with rural patients. So you want to make sure that it's something that you can see yourself doing. So that's another thing. The fourth thing is real estate. One of the best way to have good passive cash flow is to buy your own building. So for example, we own our building for our dental practice and we pay ourselves rent, and it's a great cash flow for something that you would be doing anyway. So if you're paying rent, I see sometimes doctors paying $10,000 to $12,000 a month of rent, which is, to me, it's crazy high for a 4 or 5 operatory practice. But I'm in a rural area where you can buy a building for a lot less, and you can pay yourself rent, and you can have a very nice cash flow over 30 years. So that's another thing to consider. Are you going to have to rent the space, or are you going to be able to buy the space? In some of the urban areas, real estate is so expensive that you simply never be able to buy a building because it's just so expensive. You're going to have to rent forever, and dental practices are very difficult to move and expensive because you have all the build out. It's not like an insurance business where you just pick up a computers and you move in 2 days. Dental practices are expensive to build out and move, and it could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to move your practice. So you also have to consider the rental space and how long the lease is. What if you start out with a low monthly payments with a lease, and then 5-7 years later they double it, and then you're kind of stuck because it's so expensive to move. So that's another thing to consider too. Now, the fifth one is really word of mouth marketing. Like if you live in the area, so you definitely want to consider to see if you can live in the area, because you got a lot of organic growth when you start or build a practice, or even if you buy a practice. If you live in the area where the practice is at, you're going to have a lot of organic growth because you're going to be involved in a community. Like how involved you think you're going to be in a community, because if you are involved, like you're taking Pilates classes, you're coaching soccer, you go to a local YMCA to work out, you're going to be meeting a lot of people who are going to be probably coming to your practice. So you're going to have a lot of organic growth. So I definitely recommend living in the area, or at least being very involved in the area where you're at, or maybe your staff will live in the area. But if you can live in the area where the practice is at, you're going to have a lot more organic growth than if you don't, because like I said, you're going to have, like for example, if you have a family, you have kids, your kids are going to be involved with sports and going to school, so you're going to meet parents, and they're going to come to the practice and things like that. So you're going to have a lot of organic growth, so you can really benefit from that. So these are some of the top 5 things to consider. By far the most important thing is locations, because like I said, most often what I see is doctors setting up in these really urban areas where patients simply have very low dental need. These are the high middle class areas, and there are already a ton of dental providers there, and that's just a perfect storm for not doing super great. And if you have a practice like that, if you already set up a practice in that area and you're not doing well, sometimes the best thing you can do is buy another practice and combine them, or buy a chart, or somehow grow in a way with a purchase. Sometimes that's all you can do if you already set up in a very, very saturated area with a lot of dentists in around you. So sometimes you just have to buy charts or buy another practice and combine it with your practice. So these are just some of the things from my experience when I look at some doctors who do exceptionally well, and when I look at doctors who do less exceptionally well. So hopefully this helps you. If you have any questions, my link is in my bio, so welcome to reach out anytime. Bye.